good morning, people. How you guys doing? That's pretty good. How about the Zags also? I mean, that's pretty impressive. Trent, I'm sorry about your ducks, dude. Sorry about your ducks, man. So, hey, let's go ahead and pray together. We'll get underway. We've got a lot of stuff to do today, and so we've got communion today as well as the message, and so great stuff all the way around, so go ahead and join me right now. Jesus, man, I thank you for grace. If there's anything that I have been just had impressed upon me is I've personally been going through the book of Genesis, is that it is a book that is all about grace. And I know typically we think about grace as this thing that rolls in when you roll in the New Testament, and we almost treat the Old Testament as this book of this grumpy God that is filled with anger and wrath and frustration at sinful people. And yet what we continue to see is that you extend tremendous grace to broken people. That the whole idea of redemption is about rescuing people that are incomplete, imperfect, make terrible decisions, rebel against you, hurt other people, and yet you relentlessly pursue them with an irresistible grace. I thank you for that, and I pray that that theme would continue to resonate today, and that we would be people that are marked by how rich your grace is, and that grace would then motivate us to a greater sense of walk with you and a greater sense of determination to experience you in our lives. And so I just ask today that you would teach us that. May some of the little lessons that we pick up along the way in our talk today be little lessons that, again, are bathed in your grace and motivate us by that same grace. And so we thank you for today. Thank you for your word that teaches us and guides us, and I pray that we would take it in with great enthusiasm and great passion for you. So we love you, thank you, and praise you in your perfect name. Amen. So you cannot, in life, rush greatness. You can't rush greatness. For example, you can rush a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Can't rush a souffle, right? You can't rush greatness. You can rush McDonald's, but you can't rush like Ruth Chris. You can't do that. You can rush a tweet. Ask Donald Trump, he rushes them all the time. But you can't rush a term paper and do well. I know some of you are like, I tried it in college, didn't work, all right? Right, so there's things you can't rush if you want them to be great. And when it comes to things that are going to be perfect, you can't rush perfection. Now, I say that because here is this reality I want us to begin with this morning. You and I are this piece of art that God, by His grace, is shaping, right? We are this masterpiece underway by God, and the goal is perfection. We will one day be perfect. The goal is that our character would match the character of Christ, that all of our weaknesses will be chiseled away, and all that will be left is a strength that is driven by God's grace, right? That is where we are going. That is the goal. That is the end. Perfection is going to be the target. But in that, there is a process. Right? In that, there are steps along the way that we have to understand. Because as God is working something out in us, there's a reality that while God is taking us to this final goal, we are going to not always pull in God's direction as He's taking us there. In fact, what I've begun to realize about how I personally grow spiritually is a little bit like walking my daughter's dog. Right? So I'm thinking we're going to walk to the end of the road with the dog. And so I know where I'm going. I'm going to walk a straight line. It's a straight road. It's really easy. So I'm walking the dog down this straight road, and this is what God is doing with my life. He's walking me down this straight road. But I'm like the dog. Right? So I'm the human being. God's walking me, but then I'm like the dog that's right? Like everywhere. And he's sniffing everything to see, can I mark it? Can I mark it? Did I mark it? I don't know if I marked it, right? So like the dog is just everywhere, even though I'm going in a straight line. He walks 10,000 more paces than I do just because he's everywhere as we're walking the straight line, right? And that's really how we grow. Now in theology, we call this sanctification. Yes, that is 5 syllables. Some of you just got nervous. Sanctification. Right? And it's a big word. And as soon as we use big words at church, people get freaked out like, oh man, now I'm in an anatomy class. What is this all about? Okay. Sanctification is a very simple idea. It literally comes from 2 Latin words, which means to make holy. All right? or holy to make is actually the order of it. And so this is what God is engaged in the process of doing. He is making us holy, but we're not made holy overnight. It's not like the day we said, I need Jesus, I want to become a Christian, I want to follow Christ. It's not like that day we were completed in every way. It was the start of a process. In fact, I would see this very much like how you might look at a stock market chart, right? That this is really what the Christian life is like, right? So it starts off, and there's going to be highs and lows along the course of your life. And sometimes you feel like you're below some magic line. Sometimes you feel like you're above. But over the course of a lifetime, you're upticking, right? Now, at any given time, it doesn't feel like you're upticking, right? So you come to Christ maybe early in life, and some of those low marks, you might go, I know that low mark. That was junior high, right? That's when my hormones turned on. That's a low mark in my life. But then that high mark, oh man, I went to a Striper concert and I was excited. To hell with the devil, that's right, all right? But then by the end of high school, I wasn't doing so well. Then I went to college and that was bad and I experimented with stupid things and I was a foolish person and everything else. But then I got out of college and I jumped back up because I got a job and got responsible and then I married somebody and that's a real high peak. I got married and everything else. But then I realized the first year of marriage that I'm a sinful person. And I kind of found myself going back down. But then God did other things. And so over the course of life, it's like this, right? But you're ultimately growing. You're being sanctified, sanctification. You're being made holy in the process. In fact, this is a promise that God makes that he will carry you on. Philippians chapter 1, verse 6, Paul says, I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion in the day of Christ Jesus. He will perfect the masterpiece. He will make you complete. He will make you look like Christ. But he doesn't do it overnight. Like I said, it's a process. It's this journey of spiritual growth and maturing, and we all have to be okay with that reality. And I share that because the story that we're looking at in the book of Genesis this morning is very much about that. It's a story that began last week with a man named Jacob. In fact, if you remember briefly, we saw that there was twins that were born, but they're twins that are not identical. One was hairy, one was smooth, one dad liked, one mom liked, one was a hunter, the other was a stay-at-home kid, right? Jacob was the stay-at-home, smooth mama's boy, right? That mom favored. And his name was Jacob, which means his name is deceiver or trickster, one who tries to grab the heel to trip you up, and he lives up to his name, right? So even though he is the second one born, he cons his brother into selling him his birthright, giving him access to be the chief heir of the family. And then down the road, he actually fakes this whole scene where he pretends to be his brother and puts on hair on his arms and tricks his father into giving him the blessing of the family. I mean, this guy really lives up to the name Jacob. He is a trickster. He is deceptive. He is just a guy that takes advantage of everybody, gets his own way, manipulates the system to get his own way. That is really what he does. And what we saw in the story is that it finally blew up in his face, right? And he has to flee for his life. His brother wants to kill him because he's had enough of him. He's like, this guy's just constantly like up in my face, taking my stuff, cheating the system. I'm done. I'm going to kill him. And so mom and dad say, you know what? You got to flee from your brother's wrath. You got to go away. You have to go someplace where you can find a wife that isn't this tent trash Canaanite stuff around here. You got to go to my brother. Find one of his kids to marry or whatever. Like, you can't stick around here. And so Jacob, he leaves. And he's in exile. He has all of the blessing of his father. He has all of the inheritance of his father as his father's dying, but he can't use any of it because now he's on the run. And it's on the run in between places that God shows up in the middle of nowhere. At a place called Bethel, or at least it becomes named Bethel, the house of God. It was a no place that becomes a pertinent place, right? Because God shows up and says, I am with you. Now that's where I want us to pick up the story this morning. So if you have a Bible, I want you to open to the book of Genesis, very first book of the Bible, written by Moses to a group of refugees about their history. And I want you to go to verse 19 of Genesis 28. This is where we left off last week, where Jacob has the scene. We call it Jacob's Ladder, which was a story in the Bible before it was a movie, yes. And at this location, God has not only showed Jacob really a portrait of how heaven and earth are overlaid, but he's made him a promise. And he says, it's the same promise I gave to your grandpa, I gave to your dad, I'm giving to you. I'm going to use you, I'm going to bless you, I'll be with you, I'm going to keep you, I'm going to bring you back to this place, you're going to be a great nation that blesses the nations. Same promise, right? I'm going to use you for great stuff. That's what he hears. And so Jacob wakes from this vision dream thing and says, this place is Bethel. This is the house of God. It's not like Babel or Babel, depending on how you want to pronounce it. It's not like this artificial place where we try to set up our own gods. This is where the true God resides, and I've experienced the true God. Now, you would think after a person has experienced a moment with God that they would be all in, right? You've had this clearly supernatural event, and you would think that Jacob at the poker table at this point would push in all the chips. Man, I am all in on this God. I get this God. I'm with this God. I'm giving my life totally to this God. But listen to what he says. He called the name of the place Bethel. This is the house of God. And then Jacob made a vow, right? He's making a contract now, and this is what it says. If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. Do you see the problem? Of course you do, because I made it bold in caps. Right? You might have read over this otherwise, but make bold in caps, everybody listens. I'm shouting here. If then. See, what we see out of this is that Jacob, he still has conditions. He still has expectations. On the contract that he's writing with God, there's fine print at the bottom that says, well, I know you've shown me some stuff, and I know you've made some promises, and if you follow through on everything in the way that I think you should do it, then you can be my God. If then. Right? It's like dealing with your kid. And you say, I need you to do your homework. And they go, well, if you make me dinner, and if you rub my feet afterward, and if the dessert is perfect, then I will do my homework. Right? Your kid does that, your kid loses their bedroom door, right? Like, and 100 years ago, your kid just is spitting out teeth after that, right? So, like times have changed, but it's the same thing. You go, it's not a terribly respectful thing that he does here. Right? It's not like he says, God, all right, I'm totally surrendered, totally yours. Do with me what you want. No, there's still conditions in here. There's not full surrender. And so God is going to now choose to soften Jacob up. It's like what we do in the military, right? So before we invade a space, what do? We do aerial bombardment, we carpet bomb, we soften the target, and then the ground troops come in and handle the next wave. And so God is going to take the next 20 years to kind of air war bomb Jacob's life. He's going to soften him up for the ground war that's going to come later into his life. And so he's going to enter him into the school of hard knocks. Hard knock high, that's what we're going to call it, right? He's going to hard knock high, and he's going to spend a long time in hard knock high. In fact, in your Bible, it goes from Genesis chapter 28, the end of 28, all the way to chapter 31. And that span of time is 20 years. Now, we're not going to walk through the whole thing. I'm going to give you the highlights. Basically, what happens is after he has this event, he's like, okay, I'm going to go to my family. His name's Laban and all of what he has, and I'm going to try to find a wife there. And so he goes, and he has contact for the first time with one of Laban's daughters, Rachel. And he sees Rachel coming to bring water, bring the animals out to have some water at a well, and he sees this woman, and instantly he is smitten. In fact, the Bible says she was pleasing in appearance in every way. He was like, va-voom, that's the woman that I am interested in. And he finds out this is a family member, which is even better as far as marrying into a group that his parents would find permissible. And so he goes over and he meets Rachel, and he talks with her. And at that very time that he meets her, he kisses her, and then he begins to cry. I don't know about you ladies, but if some dude just kissed me on the street and started weeping, freaks me out. Right? Especially if a dude kissed me on the street, that would freak me out. And then if he wept, I really wouldn't know. Just stop crying, but why did you kiss me? Right? So anyway, so this happens, and he's just like, this is the girl I want. And so he goes home with this girl and meets the father, and it's all this family relationship where he's allowed to actually do this. And so he's like, I want to marry your daughter, Rachel. And he says, okay, well, that's cool, because what I need to do is work for me for 7 years. And after 7 years, you can marry her. It'll be perfect. It's like 7 years hard labor, but in the end, you get to marry her. And he's like, great, no problem. And he worked 7 years like it was just a day. It was no big deal. So then finally the day of the wedding comes. It's a big celebration, great big party, everything else. By the way, I got to mention, she also had a sister named Leah, not general or princess, just a different Leah. All right? And Leah was the older sister. Rachel's the younger sister. And while Rachel is a looker, Leah says she had weak eyes, and I'm going to guess man hands or something, because she was not attractive to Jacob. He's like, Leah, she'll make a great aunt, you know? But Rachel, that's where it's at, right? And so he thinks he's marrying Rachel, goes to bed that night, new bride comes in, wakes up in the morning and discovers he's been duped and he's been forced to marry man-hand Leah, right? And he's very upset about this. In part, though, I look at this and go, okay, so let me get this straight. Jacob. There's a big celebration the day before, right? Was there a lot of liquor there the day before? Did you go to bed with a 10 and wake up with a 2? Is this your fault? Were you the one that has some culpability in this? Now, I don't know, but I kind of look at it and go, if you don't even know who you're going to bed with, you're broken, all right? So it's kind of on you. Now, he's all mad, you tricked me, and Laban's like, what do you want me to do, man? She's the older one. I can't marry off the younger one before I marry off the older one, so now you're married to the older one, you're stuck, but if you work another 7 years, you can have the younger one too. And so Jacob works another 7 years, like no big deal at all, like a day, marries then the woman of his dreams. He marries Rachel, right? Now, at this point, people are always looking at these stories in the Bible, and they say, well, how can you have 2 wives, and why didn't God point out how sinful that is? And I think the answer is really simple. You just watch their lives and how miserable they are, and that answers it for you. God just lets you watch the misery, and that's the warning that this is a bad idea, right? So the 2 sisters are now married to the same guy, and there's competition because literally there are times where it says that Leah was the hated one, right? And Rachel was the loved one and the delightful one for Jacob. And so there's this rivalry between the women. And so God looks at this, and from that, Leah begins to have the children, and Rachel can't have any children. And so Leah's over here like, I got babies, you got nothing, fancy pants, right? She's kind of taunting about it. And so what happens with then Rachel, she gets so upset by not having children, she goes to her husband and says, I got an idea. There's a maid. And I want you to have an affair with the maid. She'll become your other wife, and I can have children by her. And here's Jacob. All right, Rappy, right? So he has a thing with the maid, starts having kids that way. Well, then Leah sees that and goes, that's not fair, because I haven't had some kids in a while. Maid, and she's got a maid. She goes to her husband, you need to now have some relationship with my maid. And he's like, all right, Rappy, right? And so now he's got 4 women in his life having his children. So this is it's like Sister Wives meets Housewives of Orange County meets Dance Moms meets The Bachelor, meets Survivor, it's all together in the mix right there, right? And so there's nothing but drama and crazy and infighting and backbiting. I mean, it's just a mess over the course of this time. But in the middle of that, God is still blessing Jacob. He's still blessing him with cattle and with various livestock. And in essence, Jacob is beginning to build his wealth. Now, he's doing this under the heavy hand of his father-in-law, Laban. So it's not like he has total freedom. Laban keeps kind of exploiting him and keeping him around because he knows that, man, everything this dude Jacob touches turns to gold. This guy's got the Midas thing going on. And it's because God is blessing Jacob, even though Jacob is terribly sinful. So that is his school of hard knocks. And finally, it comes to a point where Jacob says, you know what, I'm not going to stay here anymore. I can't continue in this. I've got a large family now. I've got all of this stuff. I can't be here with Laban forever. And so it's time for Jacob to then make his own future. But here's the key. To make his own future, he has to face his own past. He can't just go off and be blissful forever, he needs to face the past in which he betrayed his brother earlier in life, right? Because again, he needs to return to his homeland, right? And he can't return without passing by and interacting with his brother Esau. And so you have a crisis. And it's a crisis that all of his deception can't mitigate. Because that's usually what he goes to, right? Every time there's a problem, he utilizes deception. Even when he was leaving his father-in-law, he utilized a level of deception. Let's just all kind of go in the middle of the night. We'll pretend like nothing's going on until he wakes up the next day and everybody's gone, right? He's not always the honest guy. And so now he's going to have this crisis in which what he must do and what he starts to begin to do is he begins to just focus on doing the next right thing and trusting God, right? And if you're a note taker, I want you to write that down. Doing the next right thing and trusting God. I say that because oftentimes in life, I find even in my life, there are things where I know God wants me to do it, especially if we took the story of Jacob and Esau at this point, it's going to be a story about whether one can be reconciled with a person that they've wronged. I'm sure there are things in your life where you know you've either been wronged by somebody or you've wronged somebody. This is your story. Right? And so this is what he's going to face. And he's got to do the next right thing, which is to go and seek reconciliation. But here's what happens in our lives when we have that before us. We have this tendency to say, all right, I know I need to make this right, but if I go to them, I know what they're going to do. I know what they're going to say. I know their thing. And we get inside the other person's head so much that we excuse ourselves from having to do the next right thing because we get down the road of, I know how this ends, before you ever start, right? And if that's what you do, I know what they're going to be like, I know what they're going to say, I know how they're going to respond, and therefore it excuses me from doing the next right thing. You know what? That you may be totally right. They may, in fact, do all those things you say, but you haven't pleased God in the process. See, God wants us to do the next right thing, not because it always ends in our favor. He doesn't always want us to do the next right thing because everything is going to be blissful afterwards. Sometimes it blows up even worse. We do the next right thing because it's right. And because he's watching and he cares and he's invested and he loves to see when we obey even when it's hard. And so even in this story here, Jacob is just going to do the next right thing and seek to please God, even though it's not easy. Now, what we see from the get-go is apparently God approves of Jacob's next steps. Verse 1 of Genesis 32. All right, we've jumped ahead to chapter 32. All right, we've gone through the school of hard knocks with him so far. It says, and Jacob went on his way after leaving his father-in-law and having that whole interaction. And it says, and the angels of God, they met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's camp. The only thing you need to know about that is that God's given a double thumbs up to what he's doing next. It's an affirmational statement. If the angels show up, that's a good thing. If there's no angels, maybe not a good thing. But there's angels, it's good. And so Jacob, in verse 3, it says, sent messengers before him to Esau, his brother, in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. In other words, his brother has a country now. Remember? He was named Edom, red stew, red kid, hairy red guy, right? So his brother, Esau, has now got a country. That's a big deal. That's something to brag about on your resume, all right? And so he goes, and he says, I'm going to send my messengers, and here's what I want them to do. I'm instructing them in verse 4. He says, thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and have stayed until now. I have oxen and donkeys and flocks, male servants and female servants. I have sent to tell my lord in order that I might find favor in your sight. Now, I want you to notice the approach on reconciliation here, right? He knows he's wronged his brother. His brother wasn't perfect, but he knows he's wronged his brother. So he starts off by saying, what of his brother? My Lord. When you go, call him my Lord. Let him know that I'm calling him my Lord, right? So Jacob doesn't roll in and be like, that's right, little mother birthright's back. He doesn't do that, right? He says, no, I'm going to come into this. I'm going to approach it where he's the Lord and I'm what? Your servant. Now, he has the birthright, right? So he has all the inheritance of the family. But he says, I'm coming in low, man. I'm not going to come in with the birthright and be like, you're under me. He goes, no, I'm under you. You're Lord. I'm servant. This says something about reconciliation when we approach it. The second thing we see is he says, I've got stuff. Now, that might look like he's showing off. My Lord, I'm rich, right? It's not what he's saying. What he's fundamentally saying is, I'm not here to get something from you. I'm here to get something or give something to you, right? So he's not showing up like the long-lost brother after 20 years. It's like, Esau, can I borrow 10 grand? I got this awesome business idea. He doesn't do that. He's like, no, I'm okay. I'm comfortable financially. I'm not showing up to get something from you. I want to get something to you and for you. If there is anything he needs, however, it's when he says he hopes to find favor, which means grace. So he's rolling in saying, you know what, I'm simply looking for your mercy. I'm wrong. I've wronged you. I don't need anything from you. I want something for you. But what I seek is just your grace toward me, right? He kind of puts it into Esau's hands as far as whatever Esau would choose to do next. I love this because he's not coming saying, hey, let's talk about what happened. I'll point out some of the things you did wrong. You can talk about some of the things I did wrong. He doesn't do that. He doesn't say, all right, well, let's see if we can come to the middle, which is sometimes how we try to reconcile, right? So I got to reconcile with this person because they were wrong. He doesn't worry about anything. He goes, I just want to get to the goal of reconciliation. So, your Lord, I'm servant. I don't need anything from you, but I seek your mercy and grace over my life because, man, I just want this to be right. So that's his heart. In verse 6, it says, the messengers returned to Jacob saying, we came to your brother Esau, and he's coming to meet you. Yay! And there are 400 men with him. Oh! Right? At first that could sound great, and then you're like, 400 dudes. I mean, you think about it. If you screwed your brother over 20 years ago for his inheritance, and now he's showing up with 400 guys, it's not for a barbecue. It's not for a ping pong tournament. It's not a bunch of bros hanging out and having fun and singing songs around a fire. That's not what you're thinking, right? And so in verse 7 it says, then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. Yeah, that's the right response. You should be. You should be, because the last time you saw your brother, or at least heard about your brother, he was hunting your life. And now he's coming. And so this is why I say this is the crisis point in Jacob's life. And what's interesting about crisis is that crisis doesn't make the person, right? Crisis doesn't make the person. If anything, a crisis reveals the type of person that has been made. Right? And so that's exactly what this is going to start to do. We're going to see what's happened with Jacob. He's been in the school of hard knocks, Hard Knock High, for 20 years. He's now roughly like a 16-year senior, okay? He stayed a long time at Hard Knock High. And we're going to see if he began to learn things in that process. Now, I want you to listen to where the story goes next and how he responds to finding out his brother's coming with a posse of 400 people. It says in verse 7, he divided the people who were with him, right? And he divided up the flocks and the herds and the camels into 2 camps. And he thought to himself, if Esau comes to one of the camps and attacks it, at least the other camp will escape. This is smart. It says, and then Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and the God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do good to you. He says, even though I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you've shown to me, your servant. He says, when I left this place, all I had was my staff when I crossed the Jordan. And now, look, I've become 2 camps. He says, please deliver me from the hand of my brother and from the hand of Esau, for I fear him that he may come and attack me and also the mothers and the children. I say this because you said, I will surely do you good, and I will make your offspring as the sands of the sea, which cannot be numbered as a multitude. I know when we just read through this, we may not see his strategy clearly, but there's 2 things he does that are very valuable. Again, if you're a note taker, I want you to write these things down. He does 2 things. He plans and he prays. He plans and he prays. right? And this is valuable. Part of the plan, what I love about it, is he's selfless, right? So he knows that he's the one that's really doomed, but he's like, let's separate, let's make sure that some of these people can be preserved no matter what. He's thinking about others, not simply himself, which is a big jump for this guy. But he also prays humbly, I'm not worthy of all the things you've done for me. And he prays with a faith-filled endurance that says, and you promised this thing, and I want to be committed to that promise. So in his old life, he would just start scheming. In this new life, he starts planning and praying. And the reason I said write down, plan, and pray is because I think sometimes as followers of Christ, we have this tendency to do one or the other, right? Things are bad, I better come up with a plan, and we plan and fret. We plan and make sure all the pieces are right constantly, and we just keep worrying and worrying and worrying and hoping that the plan works. Or sometimes you just go, I'm so freaked out and overwhelmed, I'm just going to pray and not plan. What you see is a consistent pattern in the Bible, especially through the Old Testament, is that people did both. They planned and they prayed. They took action, and then they took their needs to God in prayer, and they bolted those together. It's a blend. And so he blends the same trait and seeks God to work. The other thing in this, though, that I love that he's doing in light of this commitment is he's focused on not trying to win in the feud that he's had with his brother. Rather, he's trying to win over his brother that he's had the feud with. And there's a big difference between winning over and winning. And too often we want to win when we've been wronged, and sometimes we even want to win when we've done the wrong thing. Like our pride gets in the way. I don't want to have to admit I did the wrong thing, so I've got to figure out a way to manipulate this so I didn't look so bad. He's not trying to win. He's trying to win over, right? And so it says in verse 13, so he stayed there that night, right? And from what he had with him, he took as presents for his brother to give to Esau. He starts to come up with this idea. I've planned, I've prayed, now I'm going to send presents. And so you get this whole list of things that he's going to send as presents, female goats and male goats and milking camels. Did you even know there was milking camels? It's so weird. Yes, I'll take those milking camels over there, all right? Right? He sent cows and female donkeys and male donkeys and everything else, and he put them in groups, right? So it was like, we're going to put all the cows here, we're going to put all the female donkeys here, we're going to put all the male donkeys there, we're going to put the milking cows there, we're going to put everything, and we're going to send them in waves. Gift after gift after gift, right? It's like the 12 days of Christmas, 30 milking camels, like it's just going to be a wave of gifts that are coming to Esau. That's his plan, right? And so he says, have him pass ahead of me and put space between drove and drove. So again, he's going to be at the very end of the gift-giving process. And on the first day, your brother that screwed you over, that's his plan. And so he's going to send them along. And in verse 17, it says, he instructed the first. He said, when Esau, my brother, meets you and asks, to whom do you belong and where are you going and who is all of this from and ahead of you and everything, he's like, here's what you're going to say to him. They belong to your servant Jacob. Esau, they belong to your servant Jacob. Your brother is back, and he sees himself as your servant. It's a great move. And they are a present sent to my lord Esau. And moreover, your brother is behind us. He's in this caravan. He's at the end. It says, likewise, he instructed the second and the third, and all who followed in droves. You will say the same thing to Esau when you find him, and you shall say, moreover, your servant Jacob is behind us. So again, servant Jacob, Lord Esau, waves of gifts. He did this because in verse 20 it says, for he thought to himself, I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterwards shall see his face, and perhaps he will accept me. He doesn't know for sure. He's just doing the next right thing. Sometimes they're not going to accept you. Sometimes they're not going to be happy to see you. Sometimes they're just going to chew your face off and walk away. Or in this case, cut your head off and walk away. But he's hoping he will accept him back. So it says, the presents passed ahead of him, and he himself stayed that night in the camp. And so it's all unfolding. The next 24 hours are going to be big. And I look at this and go, man, it's a good plan. It's wise. It's got the best chance for success. But before Jacob can meet Esau, Jacob needs to meet God. I mean, he's doing good stuff. It's been a long time since he and God have had a real interaction, though. 20 years. Bethel was the last time. Angel showed up to say, you're going the right direction. But now he's got to meet God again if he's going to meet his brother well. And so in verse 22, it says, the same night he arose and he took 2 of his wives, his female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. And he took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. So he takes everything, puts it on one side of the fjord and stream, and then he's on the other side by himself, right? It says Jacob was left alone. But then out of nowhere, a man wrestled with him until the break of day. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the day is broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, my name is Jacob, deceiver. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, one who struggles with God. That's what Israel means, one who struggles with God. For you have striven with God and with men, and you have prevailed. And so Jacob called the name of that place Peniel, saying, for I have seen the face of God face to face, and my life has been delivered. And so the son rose, and he went away from the camp limping because of his hip. Now, this is one of those stories that you hear in Sunday school, right? And it's kind of a weird story. Right? I mean, all the way around, it's weird. But I try to think, like, in terms of when I'm reading about these different stories, I try to imagine what it's like to be in the sandals of that person. Right? So just imagine, here's Jacob, the night before this big potential conflict, right? It's a crisis moment. This could go so poorly that your wives are killed, your children are killed, everything you own is taken away, and you are the last one to die. I mean, this isn't like the IRS sent you a letter and you're nervous. This is a big deal. So they're on the other side. Here he is. He's worried. He's anxiety-ridden. He's fatigued. He's pondering. He's just maybe hoping like he can get a little time with God, and maybe God, by his grace, will just kind of coat his soul with a sense of confidence and peace and everything else. And so you're there, it's dark, it's stars, it's quiet, and all of a sudden some dude jumps out of the bushes and attacks you? Like, imagine that. That is not exactly what I see coming when I'm reading the story. Some dude starts beating the clothes off your body because you're just sitting there. But this isn't just any dude. The Bible actually tells us elsewhere that this is an angel that's sent by God to represent God in the life of Jacob and to wrestle with him in a way that has implications. Right? But if I'm Jacob, all I know now is that I've got a serious case of PTSD and I'm in a half Nelson because I didn't see this coming. But see, God is doing this, and there's a point to it. And I would say, if I try to simplify the point, is that life is struggle. Life is struggle, right? Life is really about wrestling with things. You wrestle with how to raise your kids. As teenagers, you wrestle with your parents and how to honor them, but find your own person. In life, you wrestle with employers, and you wrestle with neighbors, and you wrestle with your education, and you wrestle with your finances. There's a lot of wrestling that goes on in life. And if you really boiled the wrestling match down, there's only 2 individuals that you can end up wrestling with. You either wrestle with God or you wrestle with yourself. Right? It's that simple. And for 20 plus years, 30, maybe even upwards of 40 years, Jacob has struggled and wrestled to get his own way. Right? He's just wrestled to get his own way. And so he's used manipulation. He's wrestled by using manipulation, and all that's done is broken relationships. He's also wrestled in his work, and while he's earned a lot, he's had to give a lot away. So really, it's not a net gain in some ways. It's kind of like as much as he earned, he had to part off to his father-in-law, and so he's wrestled in his work, and it didn't get him ahead. He's wrestled with his fears, and most of the time it means he's running away from something because he wrestles with his fears, so he flees in all of that. He tries to take a lot of shortcuts that are sinful, and they've led to long, hard roads in his life, but now he's beginning to learn. He's beginning to learn that I've been wrestling my whole life. This midnight wrestling match is nothing. I've been wrestling my whole life because all of life is struggle. And I'm realizing that the more I wrestle in myself, with myself, for what I want, it leads to dead ends. But now I'm wrestling with God. And in wrestling with God, even though I lose, I win. Right? Because ultimately he loses. But in the losing, he's a winner. Where when you wrestle with yourself, you wrestle, you lose, and you just lose. There's nothing else beyond that. There's no blessing for wrestling with yourself because you're a circle to yourself. But when you wrestle with God, there's going to be a blessing. In fact, I like the way A.W. Tozer said this. He says, the Lord cannot fully bless a person until he has first conquered them. The Lord cannot fully bless a person until he has first conquered them. And so Jacob and God, they wrestle, and he is wounded, but from that he will be blessed. Here's what that means for us, though, too, as we wrestle with God. First thing I want you to know is that in the wrestling matches that God brings into our lives, where it's really us wrestling with God, oftentimes he will have to hurt you before he can heal you. He'll have to hurt you before he can heal you. That's exactly what happens with Jacob. He has to wound him before he can bless him. I say that up front because sometimes when people are wrestling with God and God brings a wound, they don't stay in the wrestling match. They get angry at God. They get frustrated at God. Why is God doing this to me? Why is God not blessing me? Why is this problem here? And they become angry at God or resentful of God or bitter at God. Instead of realizing that God is giving the wound for your blessing, they go, I feel the wound and I just despise you now. And they walk away because they don't want to stay on the mat with God and wrestle. And that's another big lesson. You've got to stay in the wrestling match with God. If you don't want to stay in the wrestling match, you're just going to walk out wounded and you're going to be alone. And I've seen a lot of people, they've done that. They started to wrestle with God, and then God did something in their life, or God brought something to their attention, or God confronted something, and they resisted that, or they rebelled. They said, I'm done, uncle, out, tap out, I'm finished, but I'm not following you. I'm just finished with you. That can happen. But see, Jacob, he's winning by losing. He's crippled with a blessing here. He's not giving up. That's why even as daybreak goes and the angel says, dude, let's stop. No, I'm not done until you bless me. I'm not done wrestling with you, God. Sometimes you just got to be willing to keep wrestling with God. I think about it in my own life. There's been seasons where there was a wrestling match between myself and God, and I quit early. I quit early because I was just fed up, right? And then the series of events that came out of that were back into the school of hard knocks. Where there's been other times where I've wrestled with God, and it's a true wrestle, and I'm even like, God, I don't know about this, and I don't know about that, and I don't understand this, and why are you letting this happen? But I'm going to keep wrestling with you. I'm going to keep engaging you as opposed to disengage and walk away. And it's like somehow the more you stay engaged, the more you wrestle with him, eventually the day breaks. And then eventually the blessing comes. You go, oh, now I see why you hurt me to help me. I see why you wounded me so that you could bless me. And I think this is true to all sorts of struggles, right? Think about the vices that we have in life. Might be lust vices or spending vices or talking, gossip, secret vices, any number of vices we can have in life. That you go, I wrestle with that vice, right? So you have a choice. You can either wrestle just with the vice and then it only hurts in the end, or you can wrestle with God in light of the vice and there's blessing in the end. You either just go, the vice is going to be the vice. It's going to be part of my life forever. Just once one, always one. So I just got to learn to cope by binge and purge and everything. Or you can wrestle with God and say, God, I want to overcome this vice. I want to wrestle with you. Same when it comes to the area of doubt. Some of us struggle with doubt. And some people who have struggled with doubt, they struggle with doubt in God and they get fed up and they go, forget it. I don't even believe you exist because if you're going to create this much pain in my doubt, I'm done. So they stop wrestling with God and they just now wrestle with themselves. But for the person that says, I'm going to keep wrestling with you, God, I'm struggling with doubt. I'm going to keep coming to the mat and keep fighting you till you bless me. Well, it's a different story. There's peace. And so there's this struggle. Jacob has lived through the struggle. Jacob has seen how God works in the struggle, and he's got a limp to prove it, but he's blessed by God. He's ready, in essence, for the next leg of his journey because his limp is that of a God-mastered man. And some of us, we do. We have limps in life, but we have limps because we are God-mastered people. And when you're a God-mastered person and God has brought that limp to your life, what's amazing about that is there's nothing else in life that can threaten you. And so you can face life in those ways. And so that's what we're going to start to see in some ways with Jacob, that he's Israel. Israel means what? Struggles with God. He's a man who struggles with God. But I want to add something to that because, again, it's like what I said earlier, we are in process. Right? He's Israel. He struggles with God, but sometimes the struggle is a struggle, and sometimes Israel still is Jacob. But that's all of us, right? I mean, that's all of us. You know what we are? We're holy sinners. We're holy sinners. We're people who wrestle with God. We're Israel, and we're Jacob who sometimes deceives even ourselves, probably mostly ourselves. And so we're going to see this dualism where God is working something out in him, but he's not perfect, he's not complete, he's a masterpiece in process. Genesis 33, verse 1. It says, "And Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 female servants." Here's what he did. He put the servants with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. This is where he's still a Jacob. He's still a Jacob. He's playing favorites, right? Put the "all right, Rabbi" in the front, and then man, hands, wife next, and then hottie in the back with his favorite kid, Joseph, which this is going to haunt him later too, playing favorites just like his old man did, right? But he's thinking, man, if Esau shows up and goes total Quentin Tarantino, at least maybe somebody will live. That's what he's thinking. And let's just put him in the order of expendable to least expendable, right? So, he's Jacob, but he's also Israel. Verse 3, he himself went on before them, and he bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. So while he put the least favored women in the front, he went in front of all of them. Whew, he went from Jacob to Israel. And when he starts to come near his brother, he keeps bowing down, and he walks, and he would bow down, and he would walk, and he would bow down. And this is utter surrender, right? This 7 different iterations is utter surrender. He's like, everything I have is yours. What he's saying is literally, I know I stole your birthright. I know I shafted you out of everything. I know I've been wrong, but you're Lord. I'm servant. All that I have is yours. I surrender 100% to you. I mean, that's a big deal in reconciliation. It's one thing to show up and be like, sorry. It's another thing to say, you know what, I want to repay everything that I've wronged. I want to be in a position of utter submission to you. I want to give back everything I stole, right? That's a great heart. But before Jacob could even give his speech, verse 4, it says, "But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept." They wept. I mean, it almost perfectly mirrors the prodigal father in the New Testament. The sinful son, Jacob, has come home after being foolish and dumb for years. And here's Esau just weeping with his brother, and Jacob weeping. And again, imagine if Jacob would have said, I know what my brother's going to do as soon as I show up. He's not going to accept me. He's not going to like me. I know what his character's like. I know his personality. He's a hothead. I'm not going to do it. If he didn't do it, he wouldn't have this. Right? He just did the next right thing when it came to reconciling with his brother. It's a great lesson on how we can maybe look at reconciliation as well. So in verse 8, it says, Esau said, "What do you mean by all of this company that I have met?" And Jacob answered, he said, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." And Jacob said, "No, please. If I found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand. For I've seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you've accepted me. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough Thus he urged him, and Esau took the gift. I love the heart here between the two. No, you. No, you. No, you. No, you. Okay. Right? But it says something about this process of reconciliation. Right? And what I love about Jacob in this scene is, again, first of all, he doesn't just say, I'm sorry. It's easy to do that, right? When you've wronged somebody. I'm sorry that you reacted like you did, right? I'm sorry that it made you so emotional. Little Miss Unstable, right? That's but that's what a sorry is. My wife and I learned that early in our marriage. We had read something someplace that says, never tell your spouse sorry, but rather say, will you forgive me? Because it puts it on you, right? I have wronged you, will you forgive me? That's really, in essence, what's going on here. There's restitution involved, right? The other thing about Jacob that I love here is that he doesn't claim that any of his wealth has been a personal accomplishment. No, he says, God has graciously dealt with me, right? I didn't earn any of this, right? I got duped into the women, but the stuff, I didn't earn any of this. God has been gracious with me. He actually says it twice. He actually says it earlier in verse 5 of chapter 33. In fact, 3 times God is invoked from verses 5 to 11. So Jacob's saying, God's done, God's done, God's done. In other words, that promise back at Bethel where he says, if then, God has done the if, even though it was a dumb if. God's fulfilled the if. This is grace. This is total grace. But Jacob is now in the then phase. Then you will be my God. So he's like, God's done this, God's done this, God's done this. And while Esau is not vengeful, he's also not terribly faithful to God. While Jacob is saying, hey man, God has been gracious with me. I have everything by God. Esau says, I've done fine. I've got enough. Right? He doesn't say, well, God has blessed me too here in Edom. He doesn't say that. He's just like, I got enough. You got God. That's great for you. I'm doing it on my own. I'm fine. Right? So Esau is no man of faith necessarily. Jacob is the one that is looking to God and knowing that God has blessed him. And so what I would say in all of this is that Jacob clearly gets God now. Right? He struggled with God. He's seen God work. He's seen God deliver. He really has begun to adopt what his name now means, that he is Israel. But like I said, the struggle's still real. Just like in our lives, the struggle's still real. We experience God in times in our life, and we go, man, I want to keep drilling down and to know that God more. And then things happen, and it kind of deteriorates, and we kind of fall victim to being all too earthly. And then we need, that's right, I'm focused on God again, and God's done something in my life, and I focus on God again, and we're doing good for a while, but then again, we kind of slip into this other space. And in other words, we vacillate a lot between sometimes we're Jacob and sometimes we're Israel. Just like Jacob is sometimes Jacob and Jacob is sometimes Israel. He's had an Israel moment here. And as soon as you think he's got it, you see he slides right back into a Jacob moment again. Verse 12. It says, then Esau said, let us journey on our way, and I will go ahead of you. But Jacob said to him, my Lord knows that the children are frail and that the nursing flocks and herds that I'm having to care for, if I drive them hard in one day, the flocks are going to die. He says, let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly at the pace of the livestock as they go ahead of me, and at the pace of the children, and then I will come to my Lord at Seir. So Esau said, well, let me leave some of my people with you. They can help. And he says, well, why is there a need for that? That's what Jacob says. Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. So Esau returned that day to his home, but Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built himself a house and made booths for his livestock. In other words, he lied to his brother. His brother says, come home with me. My brother's returned. We'll be together, everything else. I'll be there in a day or two. Let me just go a little slower. You go ahead. I'll see you in a few days. All right, I can leave some people. No, don't leave anybody. I'll be there. You go. Right? And then, as soon as his brother's out of sight, we're not going home with him. We're going this way. And what's sad about this is that he also shortchanges himself. This is why I go back to when we take things in our own hands, we shortchange ourselves. Because he doesn't go to where he's supposed to go. Where is he supposed to go? He's supposed to go back to Bethel. He's supposed to go back to where he met with God, the house of God. That's where he's supposed to make the homestead. He doesn't do that. He goes to another location instead. He shortchanges himself. He's going to miss out on God's best because he went with a second best. And to do it, he had to be deceptive. Now, again, I highlight this whole story because I can't help but, again, reinforce the idea that this is our story too. Go back to our little stock market graph, right? This is our lives. We're both Jacob and Israel, all of us. All of us have moments where we're tight with God, and all of us have moments where we're distant from God, and all of us have moments where we're obeying God, and all of us have moments where we're disobeying God. And yet God, in his irresistible, driving grace, preserves us. Just like Jacob, right? Sometimes inside the church, we should rightly focus on our morals and our actions and our duties, and that's all good, but we sometimes can get so locked in there, we forget that really we're kept only by grace. We're not earning anything as far as grace goes. We're not earning our entrance into heaven. It is God's preserving grace that moves us along, carries us on to completion, that Philippians 1:6. Even though, sometimes we do a terrible job. We're the dog. God's taken us. But it's hard. It's a hard journey. Now, maybe for some of us in this room, in that journey, you kind of hear all this and you go, yeah, whatever. Yeah, sometimes I'm a Jacob, sometimes I'm an Israel. I'm probably more of a Jacob than an Israel, but whatever. I mean, hey. What I would say is if we decide to settle for a Jacob life, it doesn't mean we're not saved by God's grace, but I will say that it is not an abundant life. It's not an abundant life. But then there's others in this room that go, I know that I'm sometimes a Jacob and I'm sometimes an Israel, and it burdens me. It burdens me that I'm so bipolar in that, and I want to be different. I want to be closer to God, but I wrestle, sometimes with myself, sometimes with God. Well, let me give you an encouragement from a person that understands this battle all too well. He tells this story. He tells it in Romans 7. Paul is talking. He says, you know what? I dig the Bible. I dig the Bible. I dig God's law. I dig what he tells me to do. I love it. But I'm not the best guy always. He says, but the trouble is not with the law, right? Because the law, it's spiritual, it's good. The Bible's spiritual and good. What God calls us to is spiritual and good. He says, the trouble, it's with me, for I'm all too human. I'm a slave to sin. He says, I don't really understand myself, or I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. And if I know what I'm to do is wrong, this shows that I agree that the law is good. I'm on the same page with God mentally. I know what I should do, right, wrong, but I keep doing the wrong thing instead of the right thing. He says, because of this, I'm not the one who's doing it. It's the sin living in me that does it. I know that in myself nothing good lives, that is in my sinful nature. I want to do what is right, but I can't. I want to do what is good, but I don't. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway. But if I do what I don't want to do, I'm not really the one doing the wrong. It is the sin that's living in me that does it. He says, I'll tell everybody, I have discovered this principle in life that when I want to do what is right, I inevitably do what is wrong. I love God's law with all of my heart, but there's another power within me that makes war with my mind, the power that makes me a slave to the sin that is still within me. He says, oh, what a miserable person I am. Who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death? Does that sound familiar to you? It does to me. I read that, I go, that is so often my life. The very thing I don't want to do, I do. I lose my temper, I get frustrated, I struggle with things, I struggle with doubt, whatever it is. There's all this stuff, but I want to be more like an Israel that wrestles with God, but I become like a Jacob that wrestles with myself. And so I echo Paul. What a miserable person I am. Who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death? It sounds like a Poe poem right now. But then I love the upbeat, verse 25. He says, thank God. He says, thank God the answer is in Jesus Christ, our Lord. Right? in myself, I don't have a lot I can bring to the table. In Christ, wrestling with him, everything and more is brought to the table. He frees us from us. What I love about this morning is that this morning is our morning of communion and our morning where after the communion we take our offering. And I love this because, again, what is the essence of what communion is? It's remembering what Jesus has done for us. That's what it's about. It's a recollection of all that he has accomplished on our behalf so that we might be, again, this masterpiece in process, perfection being worked out over the course of time. And so every time we take communion, we're reminded of what he has begun and what he will complete. He's begun a work in you, and he will carry it on to completion. Every month when we take communion, it is like a waypoint to that completion. And from communion to communion each month, you may have highs and lows. You may be like that stock market where you're like, man, it was a bad month, it was a good month, bad week, good week, whatever it is, right? But he's moving you to completion. And so you take communion confidently. Confidently. He's done this for me so that he can make me everything he wants me to be. We have freely received from him. And in light of that, I think about then offering that will come out of that. We freely give. It's just one of the many ways that we freely give because we freely receive, because God's grace has penetrated our lives. We want to be gracious and generous in all the different veins of our life, doing the next right thing, trusting God because God has promised to provide all things. So it all comes together. And so this morning, as we settle our hearts for this moment of communion or Eucharist, whatever name you would prefer, we reflect on what he has done so freely. And that leads us into our offering, which is what we freely do because he's freely given. I want us to pray right now for our communion as they get ready to pass the elements. Jesus, I thank you for so great a sacrifice, so great a gift. And I pray that we will just settle in with you in such a way that we're destined to wrestle, but that we would wrestle with you versus us. That we would wrestle and stay in the match until we sense and see your blessing. That we wouldn't punch out too early, we wouldn't tap out before it's over. But we would relentlessly pursue you because you have relentlessly pursued us. Remind us today as we gather in communion. Remind us of the work of the cross. Remind us of what you did. Remind us of how you wrestled with your Father in the Garden of Gethsemane. You wrestled, and you were rewarded for it. Thank you for the example and the privilege of following after you in your name.